Allora, come accennavo, la prima relatrice che invito al tavolo Peppou è laureata in psicologia all'Università di Bristol, specializzata in metodologia della ricerca in psichiatria presso l'Istituto di Psichiatria King's College di Londra. Dal 2009 a oggi lavora come psicologa e ricercatrice presso il Dipartimento di Psichiatria dell'Università di Atene. Dal 2010 collabora con l'Associazione per lo Sviluppo Regionale e la Salute Mentale. È coautrice di numerose ricerche relative agli effetti che la crisi economica ha avuto in Grecia, ma in generale nei paesi del sud Europa. Prego, a lei la parola.
Thank you for the invitation and the amazing hospitality. I'm very happy to be here, even in spite of the fact that I will speak for a pretty distressing topic. Everything started in Greece with the global economic crisis. As you already know, it has been the deepest to strike the international community since the Great Depression. While its outset was pinpointed in the American continent, its tremors were more strongly felt in Europe, and more particularly in the Mediterranean countries. In Greece, the international recession, in tandem with the local unrelenting spending on the part of the Greek government, led the Greek economy, after many consecutive years of growth, to go into reverse and gave rise to what we know today as the Greek economic crisis. During the 5-year period of the recession, the gross domestic product fell by 20.8% and returned to its 2002 levels. At the same time, the national debt rose from 105.4% of GDP in 2007 to 152.6% of GDP in 2011. To cope with this grim financial situation, and in order to avoid a potential default that would further endanger the stability of the global economy, the international community and the Greek government agreed on 2 bailouts. One bailout was signed in 2010, amounting 110 billion euros, and another one year after that, in 2011, amounting 130 billion euros. In exchange, the Greek government was expected to implement a series of structural reforms and austerity measures. That is the humorous side of the story. But what about reality? In 2010, approximately 30% of the population, that is 2.34 million people, was on the verge of poverty. A survey by the Hellenic Confederation of Professional Craftsmen and Merchants highlighted substantial income loss for 93.1% of households during the last 3 years, with subsequent reductions in expenses for basic goods, such as electricity and food. 2 out of 5 people consume low-quality food on a daily basis. At the same time, 30.4% of children is at risk of poverty in 2011, and there is a growing number of them who receives inadequate nutrition. In parallel with the growing financial hardship, we have alarmingly fast-paced increases in unemployment. In 2008, unemployment rate was 7.2%. In 2014, it is 27.8%, while for particular age groups, such as young people, unemployment rate is up to 60%. But it's not only unemployment that is a problem in Greece. Declining working hours as a result of part-time working condition is also a side effect of the downturn in the country. So we have unemployment, loss of income, debt, home foreclosures, and job insecurity. These are considered to be the most severe and adverse consequences of the recession internationally and in Greece. What about the health? Recent reviews on the health effects of the crisis have actually documented an increasing incidence of HIV infections and tuberculosis among injected drug users. We have re-emergence of malaria, a high mortality burden of pandemic influenza, and a major outbreak of the West Nile virus, among others. Of course, most of these outbreaks have been attributed to environmental triggers, but the preventive public health measures that would have contained the aforementioned epidemics were not properly implemented due to the dismantling of pertinent services. What about the mental health of the population? At the University Mental Health Research Institute, we have conducted certain population surveys in years 2008, 2009, 2011 and 2013, almost every 2 years. And there have been a number of publications. These series of epidemiological nationwide telephone surveys were conducted following identical methodology, but they drew different samples of participants, so these are not cohort studies. The sample was random and representative of the population. It was almost 2,100 people in each survey. It was a telephone survey, and major depression and generalized anxiety disorder were ascertained by the pertinent modules of the structured clinical interview. What we see now here is that 1 month prevalence of major depression started around 3.3% in 2008 before the crisis and has steadily gone up to 12.3% in 2013. This actually means that 12 out of 100 Greek people meet the criteria for major depression in 2013. No one is impervious to major depression. What we have documented is elevated rates of major depression for roughly all population subgroups of the time period 2008 to 2013, indicating the pervasiveness of the economic decline in people's lives, exerting its influence on mental health through a variety of pathways. In 2011, in sharp contrast to the classical epidemiology of depression, where married family status is actually a protective factor against major depression, married individuals were the population at the highest risk for developing the disorder. In 2013, possibly because the rates of unemployment are so high, the unemployed people are at greatest risk. Of course, throughout the recession, financial difficulties have always constituted a major contributor to the onset of major depression. This is not similar for the generalized anxiety disorder. What we have found is that for the population as a whole, the prevalence of generalized anxiety disorder more or less remains the same. But we have substantial changes for particular population subgroups: men, people of working age, married individuals, respondents who had completed undergraduate studies, employed participants and citizens of Athens. It is highly likely that changes in generalized anxiety disorder are explained by work conditions and perhaps by job insecurity. We have additional data coming from a depression telephone helpline at the University Mental Health Research Institute. This is a nationwide telephone helpline providing information on mental health issues and brief counselling services, but because of cuts in the budgets from the Ministry of Health, the depression helpline has closed down in 2014. But analysing the data from 2008 to 2014, what we have found is that the callers who referred to the recession while they called manifested depressive symptoms of clinical significance assessed by a Goldberg screening scale to a greater extent than callers who made no such reference. In addition, we found a higher frequency of depressive symptoms among unemployed individuals, where employed people were found to experience anxiety symptoms. It seems that indeed depression is a response to loss, while anxiety is a response to the idea of threat. I have included a narrative from a person, a 45-year-old woman, calling to the depression helpline. She's married with 2 children and she calls from a place outside Athens. She's in great financial distress and she reveals very intense and severe symptoms of depression, triggered by the money she owes to the Internal Revenue Service. This is a very typical phone call. I get scared with things I hear on television. I'm trying to find a solution with the lawyers. I'm constantly afraid, even for no particular reason. I'm afraid I might end up in jail, and what will become of my 2 children? My husband doesn't sympathize with my worries, and I can't seek help from my parents because they have their own problems. So we do have emerging mental health needs. But what happens to the services? In spite of the growing mental health needs of the population, mental health services have downsized their operations and personnel, and some of them have closed down. Public funding for mental health was reduced by 20% between 2010 and 2011, and by additional 55% between 2011 and 2012. I have some crude data from the Community Mental Health Centre where I work. And you can see, if you concentrate on 2013, we have increased number of contacts. We have a drop in the new service users because we actually have downsized the operations of the Community Mental Health Centre. So basically, we used to work from 8 o'clock until 6 every day, but now we cannot provide services for this time period. So what we're doing is we're open from 8 until 3 o'clock. And that limits our ability to accept new service users. We have 6,374 clinical acts. You can see in communities activities that in 2010 we had 57 community activities, but now we only have 11. And this has to do with some changes in the legislation of how community mental health services are funded by the Ministry of Health, where community activities cannot earn you a lot of money, unfortunately. So we have important aspects of community psychiatry are currently being abandoned in Greece. You can see here that mental health staff participation in scientific congresses has dropped to 0 in 2013, and assessments for certificates, which is a prerequisite for someone who wants to apply for a position in the public health sector, has actually dropped to 28 in 2013 because there are no job openings in the public health sector. What lies ahead? First of all, we should start by ending the denial. You might hear people in Greece saying that we have no problem. That is not true. We need restructuring of services for the timely and effective treatment for people who display psychiatric morbidity or who are at high risk. But at the same time, even for people who do not exhibit symptoms of depression at the time or any other form of psychiatric disorders, we need to have multifaceted interventions covering simultaneously certain facets of our lives which are affected: financial difficulties, social capital, and mental health needs. So you can't have just debt relief programs. It won't change anything. You can't just enhance the social capital of the people. If we don't target these different facets simultaneously, nothing will be of duration, so we have no benefit of duration. So we need to target simultaneously and adopt debt relief programs, active labour market programs, enhancement of social capital, and psychological interventions for particular population subgroups. We need to remind ourselves, life begins on the other side of despair. Thank you.
Professor Berardi è professore ordinario di psichiatria all'Università di Bologna, che è il benvenuto e ci ha fatto la sorpresa di venire senza dire niente.
Dr. Peppou, my congratulations for this study. No, it's a very, very important study, both at an ethical and scientific and clinical level. Let me ask you, this study is only focused on Greece, or you are aware of other people who have collected similar data in outer southern European countries like Italy, for example, or Portugal? Another question is, RGPs, general practitioners, have been general practitioners sensibilized, involved in this intervention, and also have you examined psychotropic drug prescription data?
Thank you. in terms of general practitioners, in Greece we do not have a well-established primary care. So basically what it happens is community mental health centers, unfortunately, act like gatekeepers. So basically we have no primary health care. They have tried to reform that now, but things are not very positive at the moment. And exactly when I was saying restructuring mental health services, this is exactly what I meant, that a number of people should be treated on primary care, leaving more severe cases for the community mental health centers. With regard to the use of the psychiatric medication, we know from surveys conducted by pharmaceutical companies that we have a rise in antidepressants use. But what is even more bizarre in Greece and happens at the moment is the doctor would prescribe, for example, a pill. So a patient needs to take 1 pill per day. But then because Greek people need to pay for the medication, what they do is that they would cut the pill into quarters in order to make sure that the pill will keep for a longer duration. So at the end, they wouldn't comply, they wouldn't adhere to the treatment regime as they should. So basically, we do have a lot of problems with how they interpret and implement doctors' recommendations. Now, these are the data from Greece. In terms of international data, we have 1 or 2 publications from Portugal. We have some evidence from Spain. They're mainly concentrated on suicides rather than major depression, but there is one study at the European Journal of Public Health, I think, by Gilly and colleagues on psychiatric morbidity, and they have actually documented a rise in psychiatric morbidity. But most of the studies from the rest of the Mediterranean countries are focused on suicides. And for us in Greece, suicides, it's a topic of major debate. We have half of researchers arguing that we have a rise in suicides. Then we have other half researchers saying that we don't have a rise in suicides. Some people say that we have a rise in suicides, but they're not high enough. But then there are people who are losing their lives. It shouldn't be a topic of argument or debate from my point of view, and that's why I haven't addressed this in my presentation. But what we're trying to do at the University Mental Health Research Institute, we're very open to collaborations with the rest of the Mediterranean countries in order to be able to form like a common background, research background with similar instruments, so we can simultaneously investigate these aspects of how the crisis has affected mental health, and then somehow design interventions for mitigating the mental health effects. So we're open to this type of collaborations. Thank you.
Okay, just one question, please. Please, can you stay here?
Of course.
Yes. I would like to ask you if you have any data about young people, unemployed young people. I ask you this because in Italy is perhaps the worst problem about employment. We have 44% of this kind of people who are not employed. That is the first question. The second one, the married male people are at high risk for major depression. How do you explain this?
The married.
Yeah.
Yeah, the married people is explained by a model which shows that, it's an American model actually developed in the United States, a theory that what it happens in the family is that we have, due to financial difficulties and the concomitant family obligations and financial obligations, we have marital conflicts and marital discord. And this in turn leads to major depression, and a lot of people break up during the financial crisis, but they can't get a divorce because of money. And at the Community Mental Health Center, we have a lot of people coming for marital counseling. And I think that this is more from my clinical experience rather than research experience, that somehow when people have money, every gaps in communication somehow might be covered or misled by the fact that they have money and they're having a good time. But then suddenly, when they are exposed to all these difficulties, suddenly it's more like they feel alienated and they can't communicate very well with other people. And what we have also found is that people who have good social capital, so they have good social relations, are not protected against major depression, which is in sharp contrast to the existing literature. But this happens for people in high financial distress, not for people in low financial distress. Low financial distress, they're okay, they're protected by their social networks and social relations. But people in very high financial distress probably have their own problems, as well as from their social networks we have like social contagion pathways, so they get additional burden from the other people with whom they socialize. So I think married people, because they have their own problems, they have their spouses' problems, they have their children's problems, more like an accumulation of problems and difficulties and no way out. Because as you, from the depression helpline narrative, this is exactly what we hear in everyday clinical practice, that I have all these difficulties and I have no one to share because my husband does not sympathize and everyone else have their own problems. So it's very typical. Now for young people, I don't have official data at the moment because we have just completed 2 surveys in Athens, one on high school students. And what I think we have found is that we have psychiatric morbidity there as well. And we also have a study on a random sample of 400 undergraduate students at the university. And we have again some evidence of depressive symptomatology, but at the same time it's somehow related to their idea that they won't find a job in the future. So more or less I think it's probably mediated by some hopelessness and helplessness.
Yeah. Ok. Qualcun altro? Va bene. Grazie molte. Thank you very much.